Now available on Kindle Unlimited, The Legendary Mad Matilda. Get this great Goth YA fiction for your e-reader or tablet free with your Kindle Unlimited subscription, or pick it up in paperback on Amazon.com. The Legendary Mad Matilda. Get it today on Amazon.com. People in the goth subculture talk about gothic literature. They usually talk about classic literature like Frankenstein, Dracula, the Penny Dreadfuls, and works by authors like Edgar Allan Poe and Jane Austen. However, many baby bats and younger kids who are darkly inclined have a hard time reading that kind of material, and some kids just aren't ready for it. Yes, classic literature does lay a foundation for all things goth. However, the text in many of those classic literature books is extremely dense and it's extremely hard to follow. And most of the storylines in many cases don't relate to anything going on today in the subculture. And a lot of curious kids who are darkly inclined and a lot of baby bats would like to know what's going on as related to the goth subculture that went on in the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, and today. Unfortunately, not that many writers are making efforts to write stories about the periods of the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, and today. So there's not that much literature out there for a baby bat or a younger darkly inclined person to find as related to the goth subculture. And that's one of the reasons why I believe we have this goth generation gap going on right now, because many people didn't understand the value of literature as related to the goth subculture, because when it comes down to a culture, the art and the literature are a reflection of what's going on during that time period. And that art and that literature is literally like a snapshot of a period in that time, and it takes people to that time frame and it gives them a understanding of what went on during that period and why it was important to people. And that's why literature is very important to a culture, and that's why art is so important to a culture, because it gives people of future generations that picture of that time so they can understand what went on in that time, why this was important, and why it was important to people. Now, goth is a music-based subculture, and that could be one of the reasons why a lot of people didn't really focus on it. But as I see it, we really need to have a serious case for what I call contemporary goth fiction. Yes, we have classic goth fiction, but we need contemporary goth fiction and contemporary goth literature so that people can make efforts to start bridging the generation gap. Now, a lot of people in the subculture, they have things like websites and they have YouTube videos, but when you have literature, you have something you can hold in your hands as a reference, and that reference can give you a clear picture of what went on during a certain time frame. And that's one of the reasons why I went out of my way to write all three of the books in the Spinsterella trilogy: the Spellbound, which chronicled the Matilda Crowley character's baby bat years, which went on during the late 1980s, the Legendary Mad Matilda, which took place in 1995, and then the Spinsterella, which took place in 2015. What I wanted to do was show that there was a history to this character's life in the subculture, and I wanted to show different time frames and what went on during those time frames, because I understood as a writer of fiction how history really worked in creating those pictures in people's minds and taking them into those time frames and the reasons why people listen to this type of music in one period, and how the music evolved, and then how people's lifestyles evolved, and how the Gothic lifestyle evolved over that period of 20 or so years, because I understood how important it was to show people how things changed over time. And one of the things that contemporary literature does is it shows us that time period, and it shows us what went on in that time period, why people did certain things, and why those things were important. And that's very important to a culture as related to literature. And I believe that we really do need more writers of goth fiction so people can get a sense of what went on during the late 80s, the early 90s, the 2000s, because when it comes down to this goth generation gap that I see going on between the baby bats of today and a lot of the older goths, what's happening is there's nothing there to bridge it. A lot of people took for granted that we have the internet and websites up, but websites, they can go up but they can go right back down, because if a person doesn't have the money to maintain them, the information starts to get old and people really don't pay attention to it too much. And a lot of people aren't really focused on their web. Some people just give up, abandon their websites, and then the information gets lost. But with literature, it's always there in some way, shape, or form. Sometimes you can find a book in a place like a thrift store, or you can find a book these days on places like Amazon.com. And if you have more literature out there, then kids can get a sense of what went on during the 1980s, the 1990s, and the early 2000s. And this is something that I believe a lot of people in the subculture really need to focus on, because as I went to do my search, as I was working on the Spinsterella trilogy books, I didn't see that many books which featured goth heroes or goth heroines in a fictional sense, or even that many nonfiction books, and a lot of people are just taking it for granted. But when it comes down to literature, literature has a tremendous impact on a culture, because it provides younger people with that reference point where they can read about people and what they did in the past, and they can also apply much of the information they get about the past to today, and even focus on what they want to use it for in the future. And this is one of the things that's really important about having contemporary Gothic literature out there. A lot of people, they focus on the classics as related to the subculture and the literature of the subculture, but as I see it, we need a lot more writers out here writing more books as related to contemporary goth fiction, because that's the only way that a lot of kids are going to learn about what went on in the 1980s, why that music was important, why the messages of the music was important, and what it meant to the people of those times. I mean, that's something that needs to be conveyed to people. Yes, you can do it in a YouTube video, but when you have words on a page, it just has much more resonance to people, and it has more impact on people overall, because when you have a book in somebody's hands, that can use that as a reference point, and they can also use it as a teaching point, as something to help people understand about that period in time and things related to the subculture overall. This is something a lot of people aren't really thinking about, because they are taking, as I see it, in most cases, both the older and the younger generations are taking the subculture in some ways for granted, and they're thinking that someone else will do this. But that's a dangerous thing for any culture to do, is allow somebody else to control the media as related to their culture. Because when somebody else controls your media, what happens is they wind up controlling the narrative of your media, and they start telling stories that tell the picture they want to tell about the subculture, but not the picture as that's balanced as related to the subculture. That's why it's important for more darkly inclined writers like myself and goth writers to come out and start writing more contemporary goth fiction, because it's the darkly inclined and goth writers who will give you the most balanced picture of it, because they know what it means to be darkly inclined or to be goth, and they understand what what the subculture means overall. They understand what it means, and they can tell you the most balanced picture of it, and not one that would be slanted or one that would promote stereotypes regarding it. So when it comes down to contemporary goth fiction, I would love to see more writers writing more stories featuring goth heroes and goth heroines, and I would like to see more writers writing books out there. I mean, I know that there are many goths out here who are writers, and with all these tools in front of them, like the Kindle, direct publishing, Create Space, they have all the tools to make a great goth book out here, and that's what I did when I wrote the Spinsterella trilogy. I used those tools to go out there and do this, and I had a lot of fun doing this, and I believe a lot of other goths would have fun writing books out there and sharing them. And I know a lot of goths out here are introverts and they're afraid of putting your writing out there, but that's the way I used to feel in the beginning. But then as I got more confident, I always looked forward to publishing books because what it did was it allowed me to clear my mind and go start writing other stories because the longer I held on to a story, it just kept me from growing. And what I did when I started publishing was it allowed me to expand and develop new ideas and new concepts. And I believe that new ideas and new concepts are something that the goth subculture needs to evolve. And it also is something that many writers could do to help bridge what I see as the goth generation gap between older goths and baby bats. And these books, I believe, that if we create the contemporary goth fiction and start expanding the genre, it can tremendously help towards bridging that generation gap between elders and baby bats and helping them to connect with each other, and everyone can see what's great about the overall subculture. If you want to pick up the books of the Spinsterella trilogy, Spellbound, The Legendary Mad Matilda, and Spinsterella, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.